Have you ever heard of the Book of Jubilees? This fascinating text, also known as the Lesser Genesis, is one of the most intriguing yet controversial apocryphal writings. While largely unknown to many, it offers a unique perspective on the biblical narrative and is deeply rooted in ancient traditions. It's a reinterpretation of Genesis and Exodus, but with added details and a different chronology. The book organizes biblical history into cycles of 49 years, called Jubilees, creating a structure that ties sacred time to divine law. This distinctive approach makes the Book of Jubilees not just a historical document, but a spiritual and theological guide for its readers. We'll revisit pivotal moments such as God's covenant with Abraham, the conflict between Jacob and Esau, the formation of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the delivery of the law to Moses. We'll also uncover the hidden role of angels and their significant influence on these narratives. These questions will guide us as we uncover not only the book's content, but its historical and theological impact. Let's discuss it together. Let's begin with the story of creation and the origin of time, a theme that sets the tone for the entire narrative. This structure transforms history into a divine calendar, emphasizing God's sovereignty over every moment. By observing the Sabbath, humanity participates in the divine order that governs both the heavens and the earth. This level of detail underscores the belief that every action and event unfolds within God's meticulous plan. From this point forward, humanity's role shifts to restoring harmony by adhering to divine law. This perspective reinforces the idea that the spiritual and material worlds are deeply interconnected. The cycles of Jubilees reflect this sacred order, serving as a framework for understanding not only the past, but the future as well. The next chapter reveals how the foundations of God's law were established, laying the groundwork for humanity's covenantal relationship with the Creator. From the earliest days of humanity, divine commandments were not merely rules, but a reflection of the natural order intended to sustain harmony between God, humanity, and the world. It describes how the Sabbath was kept by the angels in heaven even before the creation of humanity, emphasizing its eternal nature. Humanity, by observing the Sabbath, aligns itself with the divine rhythm observed by the heavenly beings. These early laws, covering topics like worship, purity, and proper living, are the precursors to the more elaborate laws that would later be given to Moses. For instance, the text implies that the prohibition of certain actions, such as idolatry and murder, was known and observed by righteous figures like Noah and Abraham long before the formal giving of the Mosaic law. This perspective not only reaffirms the importance of obedience, but also underscores the idea that following God's commandments is a way to participate in the sacred order of the universe. This reinforces the idea that the law is a heavenly mandate, not merely a human construct. Speaking of Abraham, let's now explore his extraordinary role as the father of nations. His story, as retold in this text, emphasizes the divine covenant that solidifies his role as the father of many nations. This resistance to idolatry is presented as a significant reason for his selection as the recipient of God's covenant. Canaan is portrayed as a land chosen by God, a place where his laws will be upheld and his presence will dwell. The text highlights Abraham's immediate and unquestioning obedience to this command, underscoring his role as a model of faith. Ishmael, while still recognized as Abraham's son, is depicted as outside the scope of the covenant, reflecting a recurring theme of divine selection. His faith serves as the foundation for the nation of Israel and its covenantal relationship with the Creator. This chapter frames their conflict as a pivotal struggle for the birthright, a symbol of God's covenantal blessings, and positions Jacob as the divinely chosen heir to Abraham's legacy. This characterization sets the stage for the events that follow, where their contrasting personalities play a critical role in determining their destinies. The text emphasizes that Esau's failure to value the birthright disqualifies him from carrying forward God's covenant. Jacob, on the other hand, is seen as understanding the profound significance of this responsibility, making him the rightful recipient of the blessing. It portrays Rebekah's role as divinely inspired, positioning her actions as part of God's plan to ensure that Jacob, the chosen one, receives the blessing. Isaac's eventual acceptance of Jacob's destiny reinforces the idea that this outcome was ordained by God. This enmity becomes a symbolic representation of the ongoing struggle between those who uphold God's law and those who reject it. This chapter weaves together the stories of Jacob's family, emphasizing their divine purpose and prophetic destinies. His journey, marked by trials and blessings, reflects the broader story of Israel as a nation chosen by God to uphold his laws. Even the circumstances of their conception and birth are tied to divine timing, reinforcing the idea that these events are part of a larger, sacred order. For instance, Judah is portrayed as the leader, destined to rule and uphold God's laws, foreshadowing the Davidic lineage. Levi, on the other hand, is designated as the tribe of priests, tasked with maintaining the spiritual purity of Israel. This duality symbolizes the balance between individual roles and collective responsibility, a recurring theme in the Book of Jubilees. These challenges are not merely family disputes, but reflections of the ongoing struggle to maintain faithfulness to God's covenant. The text highlights Joseph's life as a reflection of divine providence, demonstrating how his trials and successes serve to fulfill God's covenantal promises. Yet despite their wrongdoing, God uses this betrayal as a means to advance his greater plan. Joseph's descent into Egypt is portrayed as divinely orchestrated, setting the stage for the preservation of Jacob's family during a time of famine. The Book of Jubilees presents Joseph's unwavering trust in God as a testament to the power of righteousness, even in the face of immense adversity. His rise to power as Pharaoh's trusted advisor is depicted as a reward for his obedience and an example of how God elevates the faithful. The Book of Jubilees recounts how his wisdom and leadership not only save Egypt, but also ensure the survival of Jacob's family. This act of deliverance is seen as a precursor to the greater deliverance that will come during the Exodus. Joseph's reunion with his brothers, filled with forgiveness and reconciliation, underscores the theme of restoration and the fulfillment of God's promises. This transition from abundance to bondage serves as a reminder of the cyclical nature of God's plans, where trials and triumphs are intricately linked. Over time, their integration into Egyptian society leads to compromises in their spiritual identity. This drift away from divine principles is presented as one of the factors that precipitates their eventual enslavement. This chapter emphasizes the spiritual and moral dimensions of their bondage, framing it as a test of faith and a reflection of the consequences of straying from God's covenant. The Book of Jubilees portrays their enslavement as a fulfillment of God's warnings to Abraham, who was told that his descendants would endure 400 years of affliction before being delivered. This period of suffering is not just a punishment, but a means of refining the Israelites, preparing them to embrace their identity as God's chosen people fully. Their suffering is portrayed as a catalyst for divine intervention, prompting God to remember his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Book of Jubilees foreshadows the significance of the Exodus, framing it as not only a physical liberation, but also a spiritual renewal that reaffirms the centrality of God's law. Figures like Noah, Abraham, and Jacob are described as having followed these divine laws long before they were formally codified. This perspective frames the Mosaic Law as the culmination of a long-standing divine tradition rather than a new revelation. Observing the Sabbath is portrayed as an act of alignment with God's will, connecting the earthly and heavenly realms. Angels are depicted as keeping the Sabbath in heaven, underscoring its eternal and universal nature. These laws are framed as not just rituals, but as pathways to maintaining holiness and ensuring the continued presence of God among His people. The text emphasizes that adherence to these laws is not merely a matter of obedience, but a way of preserving the sacred order established at creation. This covenantal relationship is presented as both a privilege and a responsibility, requiring unwavering commitment to divine principles. This depiction reinforces the idea that the law is not a human construct, but a divine mandate, eternally binding and rooted in the sacred order of creation. This chapter underscores the law's divine origins and its central role in defining the covenant between God and His people. These prophecies provide a glimpse into the end times, where the culmination of divine justice and redemption is foretold. These cycles, according to the Book of Jubilees, are tied to the sacred structure of time, with key events occurring in alignment with Jubilees. This restoration is not merely a physical return, but a spiritual renewal, where the nation fully embraces God's law and serves as a light to all nations. The text speaks of a world where all nations recognize and follow God's laws, leading to harmony between humanity and creation. This judgment is portrayed as a moment of cosmic justice, where the order disrupted by sin is finally restored. They reinforce the importance of the covenant and the eternal relevance of divine law. Their role as mediators and protectors of the covenant takes on new significance in the broader cosmic framework of the Book of Jubilees. Unlike other biblical texts that reference angels sparingly, the Book of Jubilees weaves these celestial beings into the fabric of its narrative, portraying them as mediators, protectors, and even co-creators in the unfolding of history. According to the Book of Jubilees, angels were created on the first day, even before the heavens and the earth, symbolizing their foundational role in the divine order. This unique interpretation sets the tone for their involvement throughout the text. This is particularly evident in the story of Moses, where angels are described as mediating the transmission of the law at Mount Sinai. This heavenly involvement underscores the divine origin of the commandments, emphasizing that they are not merely human traditions, but eternal principles rooted in the spiritual realm. Their actions, detailed in other apocryphal texts like the Book of Enoch, are briefly referenced in the Book of Jubilees as a cautionary tale about the consequences of disobedience to God's will. For instance, the Book of Jubilees describes how angels shielded Abraham, intervened during the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and supported Jacob in his trials. This perspective encourages readers to view their own actions within a larger spiritual framework, where adherence to God's law aligns them with heavenly forces. For Noah, the covenant becomes explicit after the flood, marked by the rainbow as a sign of God's promise never to destroy the earth by water again. The Book of Jubilees expands on these events, emphasizing that these covenants were not merely promises for individuals, but were intended to guide all of humanity. These covenants, described as unbreakable and everlasting, serve as the foundation of the text's theological vision and connect the stories of creation, law, and redemption. The next chapter delves into the eternal promises made by God to humanity, focusing on the enduring significance of these covenants in shaping both history and destiny. It is described as a pivotal moment in history, where God selects Abraham and his descendants as the chosen people. This covenant is marked by the act of circumcision, which the text frames as a physical and spiritual sign of an eternal bond. Abraham's unwavering faith and immediate obedience to this command are presented as the ideal response to God's call, setting a standard for his descendants. These agreements are not static. They demand active participation and adherence to divine law. While it offers blessings and protection, it also requires strict obedience and commitment to God's commandments. They serve as a reminder of God's unwavering commitment to his creation and his desire for humanity to live in harmony with his will. With its vision of sacred time, divine law, and eternal promises, the text presents a compelling call to align one's life with the greater cosmic order established by God. The answer lies in a complex interplay of historical, theological, and political factors that influenced the formation of the biblical canon. The Book of Jubilees became particularly associated with the Essenes, a sect known for their ascetic lifestyle and strict adherence to the law. While their perspectives deeply influenced the text, this association also limited its broader acceptance. Mainstream Jewish authorities, such as the Pharisees, who would later shape Rabbinic Judaism, viewed the Book of Jubilees as too sectarian and rigid in its interpretation of the law. This legalistic approach likely alienated groups that sought a more balanced or less rigid interpretation of religious practice. Furthermore, the Book of Jubilees reimagines familiar biblical stories, adding new details and modifying timelines. While this provided a fresh perspective, it also posed a challenge to the accepted narratives, leading to skepticism about its authority. This emphasis on the role of angels, while intriguing, was viewed as unconventional and potentially problematic for those shaping the biblical canon. The Christian emphasis on grace and the new covenant through Christ made the Book of Jubilees, with its focus on the Mosaic law, less compatible with emerging Christian theology. Additionally, unlike other apocryphal texts, such as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees is not directly referenced in the New Testament, which diminished its perceived authority among early Christians. Its preservation among the Dead Sea Scrolls also highlights its importance to sectarian groups like the Essenes. The exclusion of the Book of Jubilees ultimately reflects the priorities and theological boundaries of the communities that shaped the Bible. Even so, its detailed chronologies, emphasis on divine law, and rich reinterpretations of biblical stories continue to make it a valuable resource for understanding the religious and cultural dynamics of its time. As we've explored its detailed retelling of biblical stories, its emphasis on sacred time, and its unwavering focus on divine law, we've uncovered the depth of its theological vision. This book offers a unique perspective on the history of God's covenant with humanity, presenting it as an eternal cycle woven into the fabric of creation itself. It reveals a God deeply invested in the lives of his people, guiding them through covenants, laws, and promises that transcend time. Figures like Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph are not merely historical characters, they are archetypes of faithfulness, obedience, and perseverance, whose lives resonate with eternal truths. Its exclusion from most biblical canons highlights the tensions that existed within early religious communities. While some viewed its strict legalism and angelic narratives as a source of inspiration, others saw them as departures from accepted theological norms. Despite its exclusion, the text's survival, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, testifies to its enduring significance. Its emphasis on obedience to divine law calls us to examine how we live our lives in relation to higher principles. The meticulous cycles of Jubilees remind us that time itself is sacred, a gift from God to be used in alignment with his will. Your thoughts are an essential part of this conversation.